Every category has brands that look intelligent. They publish thoughtful articles, reference research, and speak with measured confidence. Their visual identity leans towards restraint instead of spectacle, and their marketing rarely raises its voice. On the surface, they appear to embody expertise. Very few of them actually are sage brands, though. The gap between looking intelligent and behaving intelligently has never been wider. AI can generate polished explanations in seconds. Search engines can surface decades of research almost instantly. Anyone can quote a study they haven't read or summarize a book they've never finished. Expertise has become easier to imitate than any point in history. That has changed how people evaluate authority. Credentials alone don't earn trust any longer, and confident language doesn't guarantee competence. Patrons have learned, often through disappointment, that sounding informed and being informed are two very different things. And the sage, the archetype we're going to cover today, exists within that gap. Its promise is surprisingly narrow. It doesn't promise to know everything, and it doesn't promise to always be right. It promises something far more valuable. I'll help you understand. That distinction changes the relationship between the brand and the patron. A company obsessed with proving how much it knows eventually becomes the center of every conversation. The sage points its expertise outward. Knowledge exists to reduce confusion, reveal patterns, and help people make better decisions. Intelligence becomes an act of service rather than a performance. This episode begins our exploration of the Find Fulfillment Quadrant. The three archetypes that live here, the sage, the explorer, and the innocent, aren't pursuing power, belonging, or control. They're pursuing completeness. The explorer finds fulfillment through discovery. The innocent finds it through harmony. And the sage finds it through understanding. Understanding is different from information, and that distinction really does matter. Information accumulates, but understanding organizes. Every day, we're exposed to thousands of facts, opinions, headlines, statistics, and recommendations. Very little of it changes our behavior because isolated facts rarely reshape how we see the world. Understanding happens when those facts connect into a pattern that suddenly makes sense. Behavioral psychology has shown repeatedly that people rely on mental models more than isolated information. Our brains are constantly looking for patterns because patterns reduce uncertainty and make future decisions easier. That's the emotional reward the sage offers. Not excitement, not reassurance, but recognition. It's the moment when something complicated suddenly has structure. One piece of research captures this beautifully. In 1982, psychologists John Cacioppo and Richard Petty developed the Need for Cognition scale. They weren't measuring intelligence. They were measuring something much more interesting: whether someone genuinely enjoys thinking. Some people naturally seek difficult problems. They enjoy testing assumptions, evaluating evidence, and sitting with ambiguity. Others prefer familiar explanations and quicker conclusions. Neither preference determines intelligence. It reflects motivation. That's the patron being drawn to a sage brand. There's another lesson hidden in their research that often gets overlooked. The Need for Cognition scale measures appetite, not accuracy. Loving to think doesn't make someone correct. That single distinction explains both the strength and the shadow/challenges of sage brands. The strongest sage brands cultivate disciplined curiosity. They welcome evidence that challenges their assumptions, revise their thinking when new information appears, and remain intellectually humble, because truth matters way more than ego. The weakest sage brands become intoxicated by their own intelligence. They confuse confidence with certainty, teach before they listen, and become more interested in being perceived as experts than in helping people understand. From the outside, both brands can look remarkably similar. They use the same language, reference the same research, and project the same confidence. But only one deserves the patron's trust. Let's dig into those strengths more for the Sage archetype. The Sage has many strengths that enrich a brand built on its psychological foundations. So I've pulled out 4 of the primary areas where that Sage brand really can shine. The first one, Sage brands teach instead of impress. The Sage understands that knowledge has very little value if it cannot be transferred. Anyone can make a subject sound more complicated than it is. We've all been on LinkedIn after all. That requires nothing more than jargon and enough confidence to avoid questions. Making a complicated subject understandable is much harder because it requires the expert to carry the complexity so the patron doesn't have to. That's why the best Sage brands don't lead with conclusions. They reveal the thinking that produced them. They explain assumptions, expose trade-offs, and acknowledge uncertainty where it exists. The result isn't simply information, it's understanding. Over time, that approach changes the relationship between the brand and the patron. The patron no longer returns because they believe every answer will be correct. They return because they trust the way the brand arrives at its answers. The second strength is it makes decisions feel less risky. Every purchase carries uncertainty. Every strategic decision does too. The patron isn't always looking for certainty because certainty rarely exists. They're looking for confidence that they're making an informed decision, the right decision. And Sage brands reduce that uncertainty. They gather evidence, test assumptions, compare alternatives, and explain the reasoning behind the recommendations. That process helps the patron feel capable rather than dependent. The brand becomes a guide instead of a gatekeeper. This is a really important distinction. The Sage doesn't create loyal patrons by making them feel ignorant. It creates loyal patrons by making them feel smarter, more informed. The third strength is it remains steady while others react. Markets overreact. Social media overreacts. Competitors overreact. But Sage brands rarely do. Because its identity, a Sage brand, is rooted in understanding rather than attention, it has little incentive to chase every trend or respond to every controversy. It observes first, gathers evidence, then speaks with intention. That restraint often looks slow in the moment, but over time it becomes a competitive advantage. While other brands exhaust themselves responding to every new distraction, the Sage earns a reputation for thoughtful judgment. Consistency becomes a signal of competence. The fourth, by no means final, but the fourth major one that I want to call out is Sage brands have trust that compounds over time. Trust built through expertise develops differently than trust built through entertainment or emotion. It accumulates, it amasses. Every useful article, every honest recommendation, every explanation that genuinely helps the patron solve a problem adds another layer of credibility. There are rarely dramatic spikes in attention, but there are also fewer dramatic collapses. Eventually, something interesting happens. The patron stops evaluating alternatives every time they have a decision to make. The cost of finding someone else to trust becomes greater than the cost of staying. The relationship shifts from transactional to habitual. That kind of trust is difficult for competitors to disrupt because it wasn't built through persuasion. It was built through repeated proof over and over again. But as with every archetype, there are shadows or challenges. Every archetype casts one. The Sage's strengths become liabilities the moment understanding stops serving the patron and starts serving their ego. The first one I want to call out is intelligence becoming identity. The first shadow appears when being knowledgeable becomes more important than useful. The sage begins collecting information for its own sake. Conversations become opportunities to demonstrate expertise rather than create clarity. Complexity becomes a status symbol instead of a problem to solve. People leave impressed, they rarely leave helped. This is why so much thought leadership fails and mistakes sophistication for value. The audience doesn't need another demonstration of how intelligent the author is. They need someone willing to make the complicated understandable without sacrificing accuracy. The second shadow or challenge is analysis replacing action. The sage loves good decisions, but eventually that love can become paralysis. Another study, another framework, another round of validation. The pursuit of certainty delays the very action that would produce better information. Psychologists call this analysis paralysis, and it appears everywhere from product development to marketing strategy. Brands wait until every variable has been controlled before making a move. Meanwhile, competitors who know less but learn faster continue gaining ground. Understanding grows through action just as often as action grows through understanding. And the sage has to remember both. The third challenge is certainty becoming arrogance. Remember the research from Cacioppo and Petty? Enjoying thought isn't the same as thinking well. The sage forgets this at its own peril. Confidence slowly hardens into certainty. Curiosity gives way to correction. Questions become lectures, and before long, the brand is talking at people instead of with them. Ironically, this often happens to genuinely intelligent organizations. Their expertise becomes so valuable internally that no one challenges it any longer. The feedback loop disappears. Assumptions go untested. And the brand doesn't become less knowledgeable, becomes less teachable. And that's an extremely dangerous place for any organization claiming to pursue truth. The fourth challenge is sage brands mistake expertise for relevance. Deep expertise creates another subtle risk. The sage spends so much time refining its understanding that it gradually loses touch with the people it exists to help. Language becomes increasingly academic. Insights become increasingly specialized. Every article is technically correct while somehow becoming less useful. Knowledge disconnected from real problems becomes intellectual decoration. The patron doesn't need perfect explanations. They need explanations that improve decisions in the real world, in their world. The sage remains valuable only as long as it remembers who it's teaching. So, of course, brands exist in real world that actually embody and exemplify archetypes, and I want to call out three. The first one is the Michelin Guide. The Michelin Guide wasn't created to celebrate great restaurants. It was created to sell more tires. At the beginning of the 20th century, automobiles were still a novelty. Michelin realized that if people traveled farther, they would wear out their tires more often. The company published a travel guide to encourage exactly that. Hotels, fuel stations, mechanics, and eventually restaurants all became part of the experience of getting people on the road. Somewhere along the way, the guide became more valuable than its original purpose. Today, Michelin doesn't simply recommend places to eat. It gives people confidence in their decisions. That confidence isn't built on celebrity chefs, social media trends, or popular opinion. It's built on discipline. Anonymous inspectors evaluate restaurants against consistent criteria year after year. The standards remain remarkably stable even as food culture changes around them. That's really what makes Michelin a sage. The guide reduces uncertainty through methodology. The patron isn't buying restaurant recommendations as much as they're buying confidence that someone already has done the difficult work of the evaluation. Michelin doesn't ask people to trust its opinion, it asks them to trust the process that produced it. And then authority follows. There are more brands that embody the sage. One of them I love is Duolingo. Duolingo is a reminder that archetypes aren't determined by personality. And I love this. Many people look at the owl mascot, the jokes on social media, and the playful reminders to finish a lesson and assume the brand belongs to the jester archetype. And that's understandable because humor is the most visible part of the experience. But humor isn't the product or the reason behind Duolingo. Understanding is. Everything inside Duolingo is built around reducing the cognitive burden of learning a language. Lessons are intentionally small. Concepts build on one another. Feedback arrives immediately, allowing people to correct mistakes while the lesson is still fresh. What feels like a game is actually a carefully designed learning system rooted in behavioral science. The humor keeps people engaged long enough for the learning to happen. That's an important distinction because many organizations confuse communication style with archetype. Personality influences how a brand delivers its promise. Archetypes define the psychological role it plays in a person's life. Duolingo uses the playfulness of jester, let's say, to fulfill the purpose of the sage. It uses jokes and humor as a personality trait, not a psychological driver. The jokes get your attention, but understanding and learning is what keeps you coming back. The third real-life example is Stripe. Complexity is expensive, not because complex systems are inherently bad, but because every layer of confusion slows someone down. They hesitate. They make mistakes. They abandon the task altogether. The cost isn't the complexity itself, it's the uncertainty complexity creates. That's the problem Stripe set out to solve. Payments are among the most complicated systems most businesses will ever interact with. Banks, payment processors, fraud detection, compliance, currencies, APIs, webhooks, the list goes on. The average business owner doesn't need to master every layer of that system, but they do need enough understanding to make good decisions. Stripe recognized that simply building powerful technology wasn't enough. People had to understand how to use it. That's why Stripe became known as much for its documentation as its software. Its guides don't simply tell developers what to do, they explain why. The documentation anticipates questions before they're asked, walks people through the logic behind the platform, and removes ambiguity wherever possible. Every example, diagram, and code sample exists for the same reason, to replace uncertainty with understanding. That's the sage. The product isn't clarity, the product is still payments. It's just that clarity is how Stripe creates confidence. When people understand the system they're working within, they make better decisions, solve problems faster, and trust the platform more deeply. And the lesson extends well beyond software. Every brand operates inside some level of complexity. Restaurants have menus, ingredients, and operations. Financial companies have regulations, and healthcare organizations have diagnoses and treatment plans. The sage doesn't eliminate that complexity, it organizes it. It helps the patron make sense of something that once felt completely overwhelming. And that's the difference between having expertise and creating understanding. So this is a lot to take in because the sage, after all, is chock full of information. But hopefully my attempt at bringing you the sage's why helped make it easier. And maybe that made me a sage brand. Because the sage isn't driven by the pursuit of knowledge. It's driven by the pursuit of understanding. There's an important difference. Knowledge can be collected. We all carry around nearly unlimited information in our pockets. We can ask AI a question, search for an article, or watch a video in seconds. Information has never been more abundant. But understanding remains really scarce. Understanding requires curiosity. It requires discipline. It requires questioning assumptions, changing your mind when the evidence demands it, and doing the difficult work of turning complexity into clarity. That's the work of the sage, and it's why this archetype remains so valuable in a world overflowing with information. If your brand chooses the sage, your responsibility isn't to become the smartest company in your category, because intelligence alone isn't the promise. Your responsibility is to leave the patron with a clearer understanding than they had before they encountered your brand. Every product, every article, every conversation, and every experience should make the world feel a little less confusing. Do that consistently, and trust follows naturally. I really hope you enjoyed this overview of the sage. And I think if you really listen to it, you can understand how knowledge and understanding combine to create a sense of fulfillment. When you feel that things are risky or you don't fully understand things, the world does not feel good. And sage brands bring that feeling of goodness, that feeling of paradise almost, through knowledge and understanding, taking complex information, making it digestible. In a lot of ways, I think I aspire to be driven by the Sage brand. Kind of feel arrogant saying that, but my whole goal with this masterclass is to make archetypes understandable, to remove the misconceptions, and deliver you the ability to fully grasp their power and how they can affect amazing brands that are born to charge ahead. As always, I would appreciate your follow and subscription. It is free. And I would love any kind of interaction. 6 or more words I hear is what gets the most traction on these channels. So if you like this and you want it to keep on going, please do that. Follow, like, subscribe, put in some commentary, and I'll make sure that these things still come out. We only have 2 more archetypes coming, and then we're complete with the wheel. And from there, we really blow this open into how archetypes influence every facet of a brand. And I introduce you to the Bull-Hearted Golden Lasso strategy and why that is a better pathway for building startup brands as well as growing brands, and so much more. So until next time, keep charging ahead.